Thank you very much. Good afternoon. As it was said, I am from Sudan. And of course, once from Sudan, always from Sudan. But it is the reason I mention it to start with is because the issues I deal with in this presentation and generally in what I try to do is very much personal much as it is hopefully scholarly and intellectual. In that the questions I'm trying to grapple with are, for me personally, a matter of my religious belief as a Muslim and my commitment as a human rights advocate. And reconciling the two is extremely important. So it is not a theoretical exercise by any means, but theory is helpful, I think. And very much a part of what I'm saying is that I think what I am talking about is very much the way Muslims actually live. It's just that it is not theorized, meaning that when you look across the world globally, you will find that out of more than 40 countries where Muslims are the majority, the state has nothing to do with being Islamic or claiming to be Islamic or Sharia being the law of the state. It's a very small minority of states in a particular region that have this problem with, or obsession rather, with the so-called Islamic state and the enforcement of Sharia by the state. So just to note that Arabs make about 12% of the total Muslim population. There are more than 88%, or at least 88%, who are outside the Arab region. There are many Muslims in sub-Saharan Africa than there are Muslims in the Middle East. The second largest Muslim population is in India, which is a secular state and democratic secular state and has been since independence. So the Muslim population of India is second only to Indonesia, more than anywhere else, more than Pakistan and any other place. So the perception that Islam and the state are united, or Muslims tend to think that, is not true in actual lived experience of Muslims. But still the theoretical analysis has to be made, and the argument has to be made in ways that defeats this illusion of an Islamic state. That's what I will try to do. So there are two sides to my main presentation, and I will try to keep it to about 40 minutes. I promise that, and the chair will help me keep my promise. That there are two sides, basically. One is about human rights at large, and on that I will spend some time expecting that to be quite familiar to the audience, and if you have questions about that, we can come back to it. The second part, which is probably going to be the main part, is the part in my title which says about the relevance and irrelevance of Sharia. So what is Sharia? How is it relevant? How is it not relevant? Will probably be the primary part of the time I give. And we'll see the question and answer is the best time, and the discussion is the best time, and then we can raise issues and so on. So this is part of a broader project in which I have been, I think, with all due modesty, a human rights activist for more than 40 years, since I was a student at the University of Khartoum in the 1960s. And also have been struggling with this question about Islam and the state and politics for quite as much, almost time. But the point is, I'm trying to reconsider, maybe we need to revisit our approach to human rights protection and to reimagine. It is not to say that what we are doing now through international advocacy and interstate politics and international organizations, I'm not saying it's not useful or relevant, but I'm saying that it is not enough. It does not seem to be having the impact we need to have in actually protecting the human rights of most people most of the time on the ground in everyday life. And not just simply in terms of the rights of elites who engage in political struggles against hegemonic or authoritarian regimes. Those types of struggles which get the maximum or most publicity about human rights protection are important, but they are not everything. And very much for me as a Muslim, how to tackle questions about the human rights of Muslim women in everyday life, in their communities, and not just simply in terms of high sort of publicized politics and sort of confrontational debates. So the question is how to confront the question about discrimination against women in family law. And family law is not only what the state courts do, but more importantly, what communities live by. So for me, the question is how to tackle the underpinnings of social, cultural, and other types of power structures and power relations that determine the possibility of living human rights before they are protected by the state, or regardless of whether or not they are protected by the state. Because relying on state protection is really problematic, as I will come to talk about briefly. So I'm therefore looking to grapple with how do we get to that idea about the fundamental human individual self-determination of the person as the basis of her rights to human protection of human rights and her right to be able to practice and to experience that without having to go to courts, without having to engage in confrontations. And that's why I'm engaged with this question of transforming attitudes about the issues where there are some tensions that we have to identify. In my remarks, I will come to challenge the idea of, because I think it's important to do that, of so-called legal pluralism. So the idea that you can have more than one legal system in the same state, I think is problematic and very confusing and not productive. I will come to challenge it in more systematic ways. But the point is, I would like to have just simply to flag at this point that I make a distinction between legal pluralism, which I don't think that is a productive or coherent concept, but normative pluralism, which I find to be useful. So every society lives with normative pluralism, but must have legal uniformity. So my argument is that the legal system of the state must be uniform and singular. But within that framework, you can have multiple normative systems which people negotiate in their everyday life, but every time nothing to do with or overcoming or overriding state legal protection of human rights. That's where I'm heading. And I will maybe, so to get some controversy going also as well, I will touch on the so-called Arab Spring and what's going on now. I mean, where do we expect and what do we see emerging out of the struggles for democratization and human rights protection throughout the region, and what we need to think and do wherever we are, wherever we are. So for me, basically, the thrust of the argument about human rights is that human rights are not only for crisis, are not only an issue when a so-called suspect culture or suspect religion is involved. They are a challenge to every society all the time, in every way, in everyday life. And only by realizing how comprehensive and how really intimate and complex and at the same time quite straightforward the challenge of human rights, I think we can take the question further on. So I do emphasize very much the historical contextual understanding of human rights and the theory and practice of it in order to avoid or to minimize the reliance on state enforcement of human rights, because there is a paradox in that, which I will come to in a minute. So the idea of human rights as entitlement, that's how I define it. It is the entitlement of every single human being to these rights by virtue of being human and nothing else. So I don't need to be a member of any group or a citizen of any state to be entitled to these rights, whether I'm a male or a female, child or old, whatever class, whatever race, whatever gender, I'm entitled to these rights by virtue of just being a human being and nothing else. That's my basic definition. So if you are talking about something other than this, then it is not human rights you are talking about, which is fine. I mean, you can say, I don't care for human rights, I don't believe in the possibility, and I would rather go for whatever is either citizenship rights or civil rights in that sense, or any or legal rights under Sharia. You are entitled to do that, but you cannot claim to speak about human rights unless you speak about universal rights, which are due to a human being by virtue of being human. But when you come to think of it closely, then the claim is quite radical and quite challenging for all societies, because the idea of rights has always been linked to membership. Historically, it is either citizenship or a race or certain groups within the race. So the idea of the rights of the human as such is recent and challenging and radical. Because when you think fully really what that entails, in terms of how we deal with human beings as human beings regardless of their citizenship. So what happens with immigration, what happens with sort of refugees, what happens with minorities within countries. And so the question is not to expect this idea to be suddenly embraced and realized fully and everybody is happy. No, it's never going to be like that. But it's a question of acknowledging the objective, acknowledging the nature of the claim and the challenging nature of the claim, and then doing our best to take it forward step by step and so on. So I'm suggesting that there is a paradox in the idea of universality. Because how can all human beings have the same rights in the reality of fundamental and profound difference among human beings? And difference is not transitory. It is not sort of passing. It is a permanent and profound difference. And we like to keep it. So it is not that we like to be humans undifferentiated. No, we like to keep our cultures, our languages, our attitudes, and all sorts of things that keep us separate. And within our communities, within our families, we need to keep our distinctive identities. And yet, we want to have a common shared understanding of human rights. And at this point, usually when I try to present this idea, I quote Albie Sachs, the South African jurist, who said, human rights are about the right to be the same and the right to be different at the same time. So I need to be treated like everybody else, but as myself. I don't need to be or want to be someone else to be treated with dignity and respect as a human being. So it is whatever I am, whoever I am, that is where my human rights lie. So there is a paradox in that. And my point is that by calling it a paradox, I mean that it is something that we have to negotiate and mediate, but it is not something that we can resolve permanently. Because every time human beings make claims about new rights or about the meaning of existing rights, they are drawing on their consciousness, on their experience, on their identities, sex and gender and otherwise, and that makes their understanding of what human rights are. Therefore, it's not always going to be a constant question. And it is not, because if you think of resolving it permanently, you are talking about projecting an understanding of what human rights are, period. You don't talk about this more. This is it, take it or leave it. And that is not productive. Because my human dignity as a person requires that I have to subscribe to these rights out of my conviction. Not for your reasons, but for my reasons. And that's why I say that we have to have multiple foundations of human rights. We don't need to have a single foundation. Meaning that some of us could take a philosophical position, some of it could take a religious position. Whatever position you take, my concern is not your reasons. My concern is your conviction and commitment to the rights. So if you subscribe to these rights because you are a Muslim or a Christian or because you are an atheist and whatever it is, fine. I cannot demand that you have to, oh, I'm sorry about that, but it's okay. I cannot demand people subscribe to these rights for my reasons for subscribing to them. But I say everybody can, so long as they subscribe to the right, and I can question that, but I do not need to question the reasons for the commitment. And of course, for me as a Muslim, I need to come to that commitment as a Muslim. If I happen to be a Muslim who doesn't care for it, that's fine. But if I happen to be a Muslim who does care for my reasons being Islamic, then at least give me the chance to show my conviction, my commitment, but not to say that you have to subscribe to these rights for my reasons, which have to be secular. There is nothing with secular people or people who have secular ideologies subscribing to human rights from that perspective, but there's equally nothing wrong with believers subscribing to human rights from their perspective. And we can talk about this in the discussion too. So therefore, my idea is that the idea of multiple foundations is to give us the space to generate and to embody and sort of entrench commitment to human rights in different cultures, but according to the internal logic of each culture. So because we can't say that you are a Sudanese, I'm happen to be a Ja'ali, best of all Sudanese, right? For those who know. But of course, seriously, the point is that everybody of us thinks that we are the best of people. We come from the best place and we have the best culture and we have the best language, fine. But so long as you don't in any way encroach on my human rights fundamentally, you can believe whatever you want to believe. The point is that we have to negotiate and we have to mediate, we have to build consensus around this, around what these rights are, despite our permanent and profound difference. And I think of all places in Canada, in this town in particular, you really understand why difference is so important. There are some Canadians who would never accept being treated as the other Canadians. I mean, very much, I mean, the Quebec question is really a fundamental example of how fundamentally important it is for people to have their sense of identity, of their culture, of their values, and to share the same state, the same fundamental services, the same values and commitments. But commitment to these values does not negate in any way the value or importance and reality of difference. So it is, the first paradox I'm talking about here is the paradox in the idea of universality, in the reality of difference, and the way forward is mediation of that paradox through dialogue and consensus building. Moving to the second part, which is so that as far as the idea of human rights is concerned, we have to push for it in terms of people's understanding of what it is to be human and what it follows from that sense of identity as a human person and how we can have a shared understanding of the rights that emanate and follow from that point. The second point is about the nature of the international legal system and the international protection of human rights. That is, yes, we have to have individual commitments and we have to have local social actors and civil society actors to make sure that we push for human rights protection. But the nature of the international system is such that we are organized in states, which happen to be sovereign states. And the idea of sovereignty is, again, the other paradox, because, and so I don't spend too much time on this, but I'm happy to come back to it. The paradox about sovereignty, I mean, is that the expectation that we expect sovereign states to protect human rights against themselves. So the idea of self-regulation by the state is a paradox. If the states are sovereign, why should they be bound to or accountable to anybody else? And who is that any other body to whom they are accountable about their human rights performance other than other sovereign states? And why should other sovereign states have sovereignty over one state in terms of its practice of human rights? And the fundamental basic reality is that we cannot really hope to, and the UN Charter is very explicit, that nothing in this Article 2, sub-Article 7, nothing in this Charter is to permit intervention in internal affairs and domestic jurisdiction of states. So we cannot intervene in the name of protection of human rights forcefully. We can have to do it some other democratic, sort of so-called diplomatic and international pressure and publicity and shaming and so on. But we cannot just simply walk in to make sure that human rights are protected. And it cannot be done. It's not only that it is wrong, it is a violation of sovereignty, it is a total futility for anyone to think that you can walk in someone else's country and make sure that they protect human rights. You're not going to be there long enough, you're not going to have the resources, you're not going to have the political will, and you're not be willing to pay the price to make sure that human rights are protected in that place long enough. Canada has been part of the experience with Afghanistan and had a mixed record about its position regarding the United States' illegal invasion of Iraq and occupation of Iraq. And there are many other problems. There are so many problems in so many places that we cannot possibly, no place can really have the willpower and the resources to protect human rights, because it takes an actual presence constantly and a constant willing to be able to sometimes fight and lose lives over the question. And as soon as we get into place, we are talking about exit strategies. And we are talking about domestic politics in terms of how can we sustain our presence and the, sort of the resources that we devote to that effort. And it is not going to work because you are not going to be in people's homes every day to make sure that the rights of women are not violated. And the fact that the so-called international community have been in Afghanistan for 10 years, and now it's not able even to define what success means in Afghanistan. And they are going to leave Afghanistan worse off than they found it when they came in. Now, that is not a promise, that is an analytical fact. You will not be able to stay long enough, and you will not be able to do enough to protect the human rights of Afghan women and Afghan children and Afghan men throughout the country. And whatever you do when you leave, you will have a regression to the, if not worse situation from what it used to be, because there will be a reaction to your presence. And human rights will be discredited for being associated with an imperial project. That is what I mean about the paradox of state enforcement. It is not possible and we cannot sustain it. Therefore, for me, the point about the two paradoxes, about sovereignty and about universality, is that only dialogue and debate and consensus building is the way forward. That we have to promote people's commitment and conviction in the value of human rights for themselves in their own name, according to their own culture and values. So let me summarize this part, which I promised to make fast or brief. First is that I talk about the concept of human rights, that the idea that these are universal rights of the human as human. If you are talking about anything else, then it is not human rights you are talking about. Second, about the content. So actually I call these the 3 C's. The concept, the content, the context. The concept is universal rights. The content is, what are these rights then? Okay, we agree that they should be universal rights, but what are they? And what do they mean? When we talk about the integrity of the person, what does that mean? When we talk about family, when we talk about a life and livelihood or human dignity, what does that mean? So any list of rights is not going to be detailed enough, it's not going to be accepted universally enough to be able to stand on its own. It has to be a constant process of debating and defining and refining and so on. And that the method of implementation has to be consistent with the nature of human rights. So you cannot engage in an enforcement of human rights that violates the dignity of the human person in the name of protecting that person's human rights. You cannot tell someone else what human rights are for them because you will not accept them telling you what human rights are for you. And in fact, the most fundamental and the most basic and the most commonsensical understanding is the golden rule: do unto others. Whatever it is that you do not accept to be done to you, you cannot do to other people, including defining human rights for them. Because if you define human rights for other people, you have to accept they're defining it for you. You don't, then you can't define it for them. They have to come to this conviction for their reasons, and you come to this conviction for your reasons. You can have a debate and you can have a consensus, but you cannot have imposition. Imposition is a total negation of the idea of human rights. So the content has to evolve through debate and dialogue and consensus building. And finally, the context is very important, that we have to understand which rights are we talking about where, for which people, in terms of their history, their culture, their values. Because it is just simply to presume that we can sit in Ottawa and define human rights for Fiji, it's totally futile and unacceptable and in a violation of the concept. So the context we have to work with. Okay. So let me move on to the other part of my study. Actually, I look at the question of Sharia as a case study in the difficulty of the paradox and the possibility of mediating the paradox. So I'll start with the same 3 C's. Because I'm sure that you heard the term Sharia a lot, but you always wondered what does it mean. Just to say it in a phrase, it is the totality of the normative system of Islam, meaning what Muslims are required to do or not to do. But what that means is up to them themselves to define, and they have disagreed about this from the very beginning. So if you want to have a comprehensive, content-based definition of Sharia, you will not find it. Because Muslims disagree about what the content is and have always disagreed, and it is a blessing that they do. I would hate to have a day when Muslims agree on what Sharia means, because then I lose the possibility of contesting and challenging and so on. So the fact that we disagree is a blessing. And it has all, in fact, there is a claim of a hadith that says that it is a blessing, that we disagree. The Quran is very clear that we disagree and human beings will disagree and only God will settle their disagreements in the next life. But in any case, the question for me is not disagreement, because disagreement is not a problem. The problem is violence in disagreement. So disagreement is inherent to the nature of the difference of human beings and their values and their understanding, and which is, I think, creative and positive. But violence is what is problematic. Therefore, the aspect of Sharia that I found problematic is an understanding of Sharia that would impose it on others. But the space for me to live by my understanding of Sharia is inherent to my human dignity as a person. So I refuse to allow anybody, the state or anybody else, to define what Sharia for me means or to impose it on me. I have to live on it voluntarily. So the concept for Sharia to me is my understanding of what God's word is, which, of course, other Muslims can agree with me. Of course, to be nice, if to have everybody agree with me, that is. But the point is that each of us have to come to that as a matter of conviction. It cannot be a matter of coercion. Now, the idea of religious belief logically requires the possibility of disbelief. You cannot talk about belief without the possibility of disbelieving. So belief have to be a choice. Simply, I mean, if there is no choice but to believe, then it is not a belief that has any value. It is not belief at all. Belief is choice. Therefore, the question is how to enable people to have the choice to decide what it is that they want to accept as Sharia or not Islam itself, for that matter. So it is inherent to being Muslim to have the possibility to not to be a Muslim. Absolutely, fundamentally, logically, there is no other way. When you come to talk about the concept of Sharia is God's law, but as I decide what it is, or as I accept, of course I don't have to myself research it and sort of come up with the new ideas every time, but so long as I accept views by choice and conviction without coercion, then for me it is Sharia, because I accept it, not because anybody else says so. And this, by the way, is a feature of Islam which I find very, very heartening, what I call the sort of theological democratization or democracy, of theological democracy, in the sense that there is no possibility to define Islam for anybody else that person does not accept it as such. You know, just an exercise, you can look it up on now everything on Google or something like it. I don't know what is the French equivalent of it, or maybe it is French already. If you Google, there's something called the Munir Commission, which was in 1951-52, was commissioned in Pakistan to define who is a Muslim. Because Pakistan was established as a state for Muslims. It was not established as an Islamic state, you will find when you look at that history, but as a state for Muslims. So they wanted to define who is a Muslim. And the Munir Commission, who was the Chief Justice, had a commission for 3 years running and met with hundreds of scholars and active and community leaders and could not define who is a Muslim. The conclusion of the Munir Commission, M-U-N-I-R, is that you cannot define who is a Muslim. And that, in fact, they found that every group in Pakistan was accepted by some as Muslims, was accepted also by others as a not Muslim group. So they gave up on defining who is a Muslim. And you don't need to. That is the irony. The irony is that not that you can't, but you don't need to define who is a Muslim. A Muslim is a self-identifying person who says that I believe myself to be a Muslim. That's good enough for me. That is the only way one can identify who is or who is not a Muslim. You cannot have a definition that you apply to people, because every definition will not fit some of the people. Now, when you come to the content of Sharia, so it is this idea that God's guidance through the Quran and Sunnah of the traditions of the Prophet is, but how do we know? How do we understand? How do we interpret? The methodology by which what we now take to be Sharia is a product of a historical process. In fact, and by the way, there is someone called W.C. Smith, who is a major scholar of Islamic studies, who used to teach at McGill, one of the leading world authorities on Islamic studies in the last century, that is in the 20th century, W.C. Smith. He has an article in which he explains that the term Sharia does not exist in Muslim sources for the first 3 centuries of Islam. According to Professor Smith's article, which I read and I have quoted him frequently, the term Sharia does not emerge until the 3rd century of Islam among the theologians, the so-called mutakallimun. And it had a very different meaning from the meaning that we now accept it to mean. So if you said anything to the Prophet or to the first, second, third generations of Muslims, Sharia, he wouldn't know what you are talking about. It is as simple as that. And this is not an idle claim. You can verify it. And go and look. You will not find the term in anywhere in the first 3 centuries. And when it came, it was coined, as Fazlur Rahman put the term. Also, again, if you read Fazlur Rahman's book, Islam, you will find the same point made. It was coined in the 3rd century, the term itself. And it had a very different meaning. Over time, it evolved, which is very human. That's how knowledge evolve over time. But the point is that the methodology by which we came to define what the content of Sharia is supposed to be is something called usul al-fiqh, which is the foundations of the science of jurisprudence of interpretation of the Quran and Sunnah as the sources of Sharia. But usul al-fiqh, by the way, fiqh means understanding. And usul al-fiqh is the foundations of understanding, or the methodology of understanding. It is all human. Usul al-fiqh is human, a product of a human process over time, centuries of time. Again, if you said in the 1st century, if you want to, you have those time machines things, that Back to the Future type of thing, and go to Medina or Mecca in the 7th century, in the 8th century, and you go around and say, I'm an expert in usul al-fiqh, nobody will know what you are talking about, and they will, okay, so you are, what does that mean? The idea is that usul al-fiqh is a human invention. And you will not find it in the Quran, you will not find it in the Sunnah. Go and look for it. It's a product of human interpretation over time, which is fine. That's the way it should happen. But the point is that there is nothing immutable about it. And there is nothing sacred about it. So our understanding of Sharia is a human understanding of Sharia that cannot be anything else than human understanding. There is no possibility of comprehending the divine except through human experience and comprehension. How would you know what God means except what you understand God to have meant when you read something and you go and research it and you look at other sources? But it is your understanding of it. It is never going to be the thing itself. So any representation of Sharia is not Sharia as such. It is always our understanding of what Sharia is. And can never be more than that. So if it is only our understanding, how can we claim sanctity for it to the extent of killing other people or violating their fundamental rights in order to uphold what we think Sharia is? So my approach, therefore, is to do very much to emphasize this human interpretation and dimension of reinterpretation. Because if usul al-fiqh was first human-made in the first place, it can be human-made again. In fact, it has to be human-made again for it to make sense today. Because none of us who claim to be Muslims would be willing and able to live by Sharia as produced by that methodology. So I say, for the Muslims in the audience and for myself as a Muslim, let us stop being so hypocritical as to subscribe to an understanding of Sharia and none of us is able to live by. We like to impose it on others in ways that we like, but we are not able to live by it ourselves. There is a verse in the Quran that says, يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا لِمَ تَقُولُونَ مَا لَا تَفْعَلُونَ كَبُرَ مَقْتًا عِنْدَ اللَّهِ أَن تَقُولُوا مَا لَا تَفْعَلُونَ, which roughly means, O believers, why do you say what you do not believe? What do you do not do? It is most hateful to God that you say what you do not do. And you don't have to cite the Quran for it. It's very self-evident that you cannot claim to be a religious believer when you are not able to live by your understanding of the belief. But if you want to continue to be a religious believer, question your understanding in order to maintain the integrity of your belief. So that is how I go on to challenge sort of aspects of Sharia, because time is short now, that aspects of Sharia that are problematic from a human rights point of view. But I do so not to say that Sharia has to be twisted to fit human rights, but I believe that if there is anything I cannot defend morally, I should not hold as a matter of my religious belief. And the question is also is, when I consider then how did I come to that belief, and I find that it was a human initiative in the first place. So I am holding the divine accountable to my human fallibility. And that is shirk. It is associating God with lesser beings when you deem the divine to be limited by your human limitations of what the divine can be. The other verse of the Quran, حاميم الكتاب المبين إنا جعلناه قرآنا عربيا لعلكم تعقلون وإنه في الكتاب لدينا لعلي الحكيم. And that verse literally means that religion is a matter of infinite. It's something that human beings can never fully comprehend or know. Therefore, whenever we seek to limit the divine by the human, we are committing a violation of the essence of our commitment to the divine as divine. Out of all of this, so that I can go on to finish here actually, because I promised 40 minutes and I have, I think, 5 minutes probably, is to say this. Now, why do I have to say all of this? I have to say all of this so that the illusion that we can have Islamic states that can enforce Sharia as a matter of state law have to be confronted on its own terms, head on. It is not only that an Islamic state is not desirable, it is conceptually impossible. The state cannot be Islamic. The state is a political institution. Of course, that is obvious. But my problem is that I have to say it is despite the fact that it's obvious. Because people keep talking about an Islamic state. If people stop talking about an Islamic state, I will not make this obvious point that the state cannot be religious. It cannot have a religion. It's a political institution. It does not have a conscience. Of course, states can be good or bad, and it is what we make of them, but none of them can be a religious state, in the sense of believing. Therefore, when we say an Islamic state, what we mean, it is the state that the ruling elite use to enforce their view of Islam. And when you see it in that light, you realize how dangerous it is to concede the possibility that the state can be Islamic. Because it's always going to be about the ability of ruling elite to use the sanctity of Islam to impose their will politically without being challenged. Because God said so, how can you challenge God? So I say that it is never God so, it's always a human being saying that God, I think, said so. Or I believe God said so. It's never going to be God. God doesn't talk to us individually. If God talked to me, then it is my understanding of what God told me. You notice I use a gender language in this way, so avoid having to say he or they or she or anything like that. Okay, so the point is that the nature of Sharia defies enactment as law. Because as soon as you define it, you limit what it means by your understanding of it. And then you go forward and impose your will through that understanding coercively. So here, to make it brief, I say that the enactment of Sharia as law changes its nature by the very act of enacting it. So the very act of making a law changes the nature of the normative content. It is no longer the will of God, it is the political will of the state. And it is law because the state says so, not because God said so. And I will give you a recent example of this. In 2000, there was an Egyptian parliamentary statute that was passed that included the notion of khul'a. Khul'a means the ability of a wife to buy herself out of a marriage, basically. The term Arabic literally means yakhla, is to take off. And as you know, that Muslim women do not have the right to effect divorce, that they can only ask for divorce, but they cannot make divorce happen. Muslim men can make divorce, that is repudiate their wives, without giving reasons to anybody, without even having reasons. They don't have to explain why. But Muslim women cannot do that. Muslim women have to apply to, at best, and not all schools do this, by the way, but the schools that accept that Muslim women can apply to a judge to convince the judge, who of course will be a male judge, why she needs to terminate this marriage. This is the so-called, the other type of termination of a marriage, which is known as fasq. But khul'a is a contractual agreement whereby the woman and the man, that is the husband and the wife, agree that she will renounce certain entitlement in order to get out of the marriage. Usually by forfeiting her dowry, her mahr. But sometimes they have to pay more. I mean, the question is how to convince the husband to give her. So yeah, ultimately it is about buying herself out of the marriage. But it exists in the Quran. And the possibility, in fact, it was addressed to the Prophet himself, saying that you should do this, and allow women to do this. So it exists in the sources of fiqh from the beginning. But it was not available to Egyptian women under the modern Egyptian state. We don't know about what, of course, what was going on before Muhammad Ali, and the modern state was that people complied by their religious schools, madhabs, and they went to the judge that they accepted. So there was no centralized administration of justice. But under the modern state, which is a European idea of centralized hierarchical bureaucratic states, the state became, for the first time in Muslim history, the state makes law, as opposed to the scholars declaring what law is in Sharia. So the law is made by the will of the state, which is a European idea, which is fine. That is not the problem. The problem is to claim that this is something that is Islamic. It is not. It is not of the history of Muslims anyway. So anyway, the Egyptian state in 2000 enacted a statute that allowed the Egyptian women to have khul'a. Meaning what? Meaning that before the statute, Egyptian women did not have a right that Sharia granted them, because the Egyptian state did not say, okay, you can have it. And after 2000, because the Egyptian state enacted a statute, not because God said so, it became a legal right for Egyptian Muslim women to exercise khul'a. That is what I mean about the state being the source of law, and as such, it is not Sharia itself. Therefore, there is nothing called an Islamic state. Whatever the state does is by its nature secular, can never be religious, cannot be Sharia. My point is that if you accept that proposition, and I think that where we can talk about it, it will be extremely liberating. Because many Muslim women and men feel now they have a religious obligation to create something called an Islamic state and to have the state enforce something called Sharia. When you realize these are myths, there was never an Islamic state in history, it is inconceivable conceptually, and it is not practically tenable to do it. And we can talk about this more. If that is the case, and then Sharia cannot be enforced by the state because the very act of enforcing it changes its nature, then I don't have a religious obligation to enforce Sharia by the state. In fact, my religious obligation is to oppose the claim that the state can enforce Sharia, because that defiles Sharia. Finally, to bring it back to human rights, to say that states' international legal obligation to protect human rights cannot be subject to Sharia, because Sharia is not matter for the state whatsoever. So the state cannot excuse its failure to observe international legal human rights protection because Sharia requires it to do so, because the state doesn't require Sharia to do anything. It is not for Sharia for the state to do, it is for Muslims to live by. You will have situations where the state's obligation to protect human rights will be in conflict with people's belief what human rights are, but that is what the states does all the time. That I'm sure that there are people in this room who would rather have the Canadian state not do something, but they have to comply with it because that is the will of the state, or else they have to go in rebellion, or they wait for the next time they can vote the government out and bring a new government in. That is the nature of how we run states. So if you have those types of problems, then we negotiate them politically, but we cannot impose our will in the name of God. Because God never authorized any of us to impose God's will on anybody else, except ourselves. Thank you very much.